Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Vanessa Weisberg, the director of the Celiac Disease Program at Boston Children's Hospital, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about research that we did with the Celiac Program at Children's National Hospital. I'm sure many of you have seen the papers that we put out. One was about shared kitchen spaces, and one was about gluten cross-contact in schools. I'm going to talk about both of those papers today and how we are using the findings from these papers in our clinical practices and advising families on how to prevent cross-contact. If you have questions along the way, you can submit them in the questions field, and I will do my best to answer all of them as we go and at the end as well. So just to start with disclosures, all of the research that I'm going to talk about today was funded by the Celiac Disease Foundation, the Children's National Hospital Board of Visitors, and Dr. Shar USA, and I have no personal disclosures. This is just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, but I'm going to just dive right on in. So I'm going to start with talking about a few family stories and why this research is important. So this is one family that gave me permission to share their story. At 11 weeks old, Avi started vomiting blood and he was losing weight. At this point, he was too young to test for celiac disease since he hadn't actually eaten gluten yet. Over the years, he started eating gluten and he developed anemia, low platelet counts, rashes with no explanation, and was in the hospital 3 times, which, as anyone knows, is extremely stressful for an adult, but even more stressful for a parent having a young child in the hospital without understanding what is going on. There were ongoing GI issues until he turned 3 years old, and at that point, he had a positive celiac disease test. So at this point, it had been 3 years of ongoing issues. So now I'm going to talk about some of the parents of children that I've worked with who have also been diagnosed with celiac disease. My mother died from colon cancer, and I thought I was dying too. If we had known at the time that celiac disease ran in our family, perhaps she would still be with us today. I had diarrhea multiple times a day, every day. I would be sitting in a meeting at our law firm praying I could sneak out before the poop came out. I wanted to be intimate with my husband, but I couldn't control the gas. For 3 years, I pulled away from my marriage because I was so embarrassed by what would come out of my body. These are all experiences that I'm sure many of us can relate to, myself included, as I have celiac disease. I was diagnosed about 16 years ago, and I also have a 7-year-old son. He turned 7 yesterday, a 7-year-old son with celiac disease as well. So now you've got the diagnosis, and it can be such a relief to know that there's a cause to these symptoms and that the gluten-free diet can help relieve these symptoms. But then you walk out into the world and you realize gluten is everywhere. And what do we do about it? You have to protect yourself or your child from that toxin that has destroyed your life for so many years. But what is the right amount of protection? And I think that's a really big question because hypervigilance happens so often in celiac disease and can lead to extreme stress and anxiety. So we really need to have the appropriate amount of protection to keep us healthy and safe. So let's talk about that. So why did we do these studies? Current recommendations from the AGA, NASPGHAN, hospitals across the country, and celiac organizations are extremely strict and can lead to hypervigilance and a very low quality of life for some families. We tell people that they can't play with Play-Doh at school. They have to have 2 toasters. They need dedicated gluten-free pots, pans, cutting boards, and utensils. And then we tell them that they have to travel with all of those things. So they go on vacation carrying all of these things with them. They say that they feel like their car is packed like a clown car. And one of my families that I've worked with for a number of years used to tell me that they felt like they were traveling with an elephant every time they got on an airplane. They were more than happy to check their luggage that had their clothes in it, but they would carry on the pots and the pans and the food because they were so worried that they would not be able to feed their son any other way. So as I said, current recommendations are not based on data, rather a perception of the right thing to do. all of these recommendations were written with the best of intentions. Everybody in the medical world and nutrition world want families to succeed. We want them to be healthy and we want them to be safe. So when these recommendations were written, it was thought that this was the way that it should be done. This is a quote from NASPGHAN. Purchase a separate toaster for gluten-free breads, or use a toaster oven that can be cleaned between uses, or put tinfoil on the rack to avoid contamination. Beyond Celiac says, no, you cannot use the same toaster for both gluten-free and gluten-containing items. Cutting boards are a hot spot for sources of gluten. All handles in a kitchen can expose you to gluten. So as a newly diagnosed person, reading things like this are extremely alarmist and can make you really fearful that anywhere in the world can make you sick. And, you know, I don't want to criticize these organizations because they're doing the absolute best by the patients and families that they work with and have really good intentions. The problem is that none of these recommendations have data behind them to show us that they are truly necessary. I like to think about it in terms of if you were being treated for cancer, you wouldn't take chemotherapy that they just thought might work. You would want to see data on, does this actually work? Has it been proven to work? If you have diabetes, you're not just going to say, that amount of insulin might work for me. You want data on how that level of insulin is going to support your blood sugar in the right way. And in the same light, we need really good data on gluten cross contact to help people with celiac succeed on the gluten-free diet. So there were two papers. The first paper was published a year ago yesterday in the journal Gastroenterology. The second paper was published in December of last year in the Journal of Pediatric Gastroenterology and Nutrition. I do see questions coming in about how you can find the papers, and if there's a way for me to send the links to the group that registered, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, you can also search for them in either one of these journals. Both of them are open access and available for viewing to the public. So our studies had a few goals. We wanted to quantify gluten transfer from common school supplies to gluten-free food via the hands of children. We wanted to assess the efficacy of various hand washing techniques to remove gluten from a child's hand. We wanted to quantify gluten transfer from gluten-containing to gluten-free pasta, bread, and cupcakes prepared in a shared environment. And we wanted to assess if gluten transfer can be prevented either by washing the shared equipment or rinsing the contaminated pasta. And I'll explain the rinsing part in detail in a few minutes. So how did we measure the gluten? We packaged all of our samples in clear plastic bags and labeled them with randomized sample numbers provided by a biostatistician. Just to answer some of the questions that are coming in, I unfortunately can't post the links in the chat. I'm not sure if Aaron is able to do that on the back end, but I can't switch between the portal and another site while I'm presenting, so I apologize for that. Most of our samples were shipped to a lab in Vermont called BIA Diagnostics that specializes in gluten testing. And some of our samples were processed in the in-house lab at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. The gluten was assayed in homogenized samples, meaning that they were all ground up, and the school study samples were run in duplicate. All measurements were made using the R Biopharm ELISA sandwich assay, which has a limit of detection of 5 parts per million. And this is the test that is used by food manufacturers across the United States to test their food to then label it as gluten-free. So I'm going to start by talking about the kitchen studies. We tested 3 different scenarios: cooking gluten-free and gluten-containing pasta in the same water, slicing gluten-free and gluten-containing cupcakes with the same knife, and shared toasters. So I'm going to start with the pasta tests. So we looked at shared water first. So we cooked gluten-containing pasta in clean water. We did 2 different types of pasta to see if the shape of the pasta would make a difference. We started with fusilli, and we also used penne, so they were cooked in different pots. We wanted to know if the surface area of the pasta made a difference in the amount of gluten that was transferred. So then we discarded the gluten-containing pasta using handheld strainers, but we kept the same water in the pots. Then we put gluten-free pasta in the water that had already been contaminated, and we cooked it in that water. So we used gluten-free fusilli and gluten-free penne in the respective pots. Then we removed the pasta and divided it into 2-ounce portions. We ground it up and we assayed it for gluten. And here's what we found. Of course, as you would imagine, all of the samples were contaminated at unsafe levels with gluten. The blue line represents the fusilli pasta, and the yellow line represents the penne pasta, and the red is the 20 parts per million threshold that we don't want to cross. So what's really interesting here is I think we can all agree that out of the samples we tested, all of them were very, very, very much above the 20 parts per million line. We should not be cooking gluten-free pasta in water that was previously used for gluten-containing pasta. But what else is really interesting here is that the results for the penne pasta were far lower than that of the fusilli pasta. So what we then did was we went back and we tested the water that we cooked the pasta in to see if there was more gluten in the water from the fusilli than from the penne. And what we found is that there wasn't. So they were actually within 2 parts per million of each other. So what that tells us is that perhaps the surface area of the fusilli holds more gluten. This is something we can test more in the future, but the bottom line with our findings here is that we should not be sharing water to cook gluten-free and gluten-containing pasta. So now what happened when we washed them? So we started over and we cooked, again, gluten-containing pasta in the pots, but this time we threw out all the gluten-containing pasta and all of the water. Half the pots we washed with soap and water, and half of them we rinsed with just water alone. So no scrubbing, no soap in those. Then we put new gluten-free pasta and new water in the pots, and we cooked the gluten-free pasta. Then again, just like the first time, we divided it into 2-ounce portions and tested them for gluten. So this time we found no gluten. It was not detectable in any of our samples. So it didn't matter if it was just rinsing, which is the blue, or soap and water, which is the yellow. All of them came back completely safe with no detectable gluten. So this is really good news because it tells us that washing works. And that if you have pots and pans in your home that have been previously used for gluten-containing foods, you can scrub them clean and use them again for gluten-free products. So now let's talk about the rinsing pasta, which was actually a really great idea that we got from Dr. Verma at the University of Chicago as something to evaluate in the future for perhaps restaurant use. So we started again. We took the gluten-containing pasta. We got rid of the pasta, but we kept the water. Then we put the gluten-free pasta in and cooked it. And then we took it out, but this time we rinsed it using a handheld sprayer using water. So what we found was really interesting. So that red line, again, is the 20 parts per million line. We did have samples that came back pretty close to that at 17.5 parts per million. So we would not recommend doing this. This is not a practice that we would suggest to patient families and not something we would suggest that you were doing in your normal life. However, it was an interesting first step to help us design future research projects to look at how we can remove gluten from food. So again, please do not rinse pasta that was cooked in contaminated water. I'm just showing you this as a stepping point for future research. So we're getting questions about what kinds of pots were used. For the original test, we used non-stick pots, but I'm going to talk more about this in the end of data that we have done since then. So shared knives and cupcakes. So that was our next experiment. So we had frosted cupcakes that were made from wheat flour that we sliced with a knife, and then we used the same knife to slice a gluten-free frosted cupcake. Then we tested it again with different washing methods. So we tested soap and water, rinsed in running water, or cleaned with wet wipes, the antibacterial wipes. So this is just one picture of the experiment happening. So the cupcake that's laying flat on the table is the gluten-containing cupcake, and then the child is slicing the gluten-free cupcake right next to it. I have a question about how long the pots were scrubbed. They were scrubbed for the duration of singing the song "Happy Birthday" with a sponge, and the ones that had soap was Dawn dish soap. So here's what we found with the shared knife. The blue represents before washing and the green represents after washing. So before washing, we can all agree we shouldn't do this. You don't want to share a knife that has not been cleaned previously. We just shouldn't do that. The numbers were not extremely high, but we're also talking about a small cupcake and only one slice. But we had enough that crossed the threshold. We shouldn't do that. The green line represents after washing. And as you can see, it dramatically reduced the amount. There were actually only 2 that had readings, sample 6 and sample 14. And again, remember, these are kids doing it. So little kids ranging in age from 3 to 16. So the 2 that had readings had visible gluten still stuck to the knife, but the rest of them did not after washing. So again, this helps us further the explanation that washing works. And it didn't matter what method, if it was water alone, soap and water, or a wet wipe rubbing it off. So now let's move on along to toasters. So we tested 2 different types of toasters, rolling toasters in our hospital cafeteria. So we tested slices of gluten-free bread that were toasted in our hospital cafeteria every 20 minutes. And we made sure that multiple pieces of gluten-containing bread were toasted in between. The pop-up toasters, we toasted gluten-free bread immediately after toasting gluten-containing bread for 5 consecutive days. And gluten crumbs were visible in both toasters, which I'm going to show you pictures of now. So first you see the rolling toaster and then the gluten-free bread falling into the tray. And then on the right, you see one of the pop-up toasters that we used in the experiment. So here's what we found. The red line is the 20 parts per million line. For the rolling toasters, we had 4 samples that had detectable gluten, but not significant detectable gluten. These were all below 8 parts per million. So these slices of bread would have been labeled as gluten-free in a grocery store. The pop-up toasters had no detectable gluten in any of the samples. So what do we know? So before we did these studies, there were 2 kitchen studies that had been published before ours. One was this amazing study out of Switzerland by Diana Studeris's group, which tested other kitchen utensils, and they found exactly what we found. Cross-contamination with gluten may occur with domestic kitchen utensils, but does not seem as relevant as previously thought. Cross-contamination during the preparation of food or cooking processes should be avoided by cleaning utensils and washing hands and surfaces regularly. However, overly restrictive recommendations and scaremongering is inappropriate. So this is exactly what we found, that washing works really, really well, and that we have to remember that, and that you don't have to have something that has only ever touched gluten in your kitchen to be safe. So there was a second study as well out of the UK that looked at baking. And in this study, they found, this was in a shared baking commercial kitchen, they found that a distance of 2 meters from the use of wheat flour was required to control gluten contamination at a level below 20 parts per million. And that although we always have to look at kitchens individually, the established control of 2 meters distance, along with good hygiene practices, was found to be effective in preparing gluten-free meals at all 5 study sites. And now I don't know how quickly everyone can convert 2 meters in their head, but this is roughly 6 feet. And we're all really good right now at keeping 6 feet in distance. So, we've been tossing around the motto, 6 feet for COVID-19 and 6 feet to prevent gluten cross contact from flour. So again, good hygiene is what was really key in all 3 of these studies. So what can we include based on this data, on our study? There's not that much data on it. We've done a pilot study, and it agrees with 2 studies that were done before us. We know that some activities pose a higher risk of cross contact, like the pasta does, than perhaps toasters. And that a dedicated set of gluten-free kitchen equipment and utensils may not be required for those scenarios that we have tested. We obviously need to do bigger studies. We need to have much larger sample sizes. We need to test this in restaurants and cafeterias before globally changing our practices. And we're doing that right now. We actually have designed a study. We're working with 6 other centers, Children's National in DC, Boston Children's Hospital, Colorado Children's Hospital, the Mayo Clinic, the University of Chicago and Seattle Children's. And we've been working on this nonstop since January. We had a few little hiccups with COVID and not being able to have families involved in the testing, obviously, since nobody's going in right now. But we are still working on the data analysis and lab processing in the meantime, and we found some really interesting things. So far, we've tested 136 more toaster samples, all less than 5 parts per million. We tested half frozen bread and half shelf-stable bread because we wanted to make sure that shelf-stable bread wasn't giving us a benefit for not being sticky from the condensation. So we made sure that half the bread was frozen and half of it was not. And there was absolutely no difference. All were less than 5 parts per million. We've also tested half pop-up toasters and half toaster ovens. We've also looked at pots and pans, stainless steel and nonstick. All of them, again, less than 5 parts per million after washing. We're now testing colanders, both metal and plastic. Again, the samples we've run to date are all less than 5 parts per million after thorough washing. And we're also looking at cutting boards, wooden, plastic, and glass. And our data so far has shown all less than 5 parts per million. We still have 2 sites to run samples at, so these numbers will continue to go up as we test more. And we're really excited to start the process of peer review on these studies so that we can continue to make updates to the recommendations that we need. Oh, we've also tested a lot of spike-in samples, which is really, really important. So what this means is that we're taking slices of gluten-free bread and we're putting gluten in them. So we're piping in gluten to make sure that the lab can actually detect gluten correctly. So we were so blown away by the fact that we're getting all of these less than 5 parts per million, less than 5 parts per million. Can the lab really detect it? So we're looking at that too and testing spike-ins. And in this time around, we're testing much bigger sample sizes. So previously we ran the samples in duplicate. This time we're running 3 extractions on 1 gram in duplicate. So these are much bigger samples than in the first round. So we are very committed to answering these questions and having really good recommendations for everyone. So now I'm going to move on to the school environment. So we tested several scenarios in schools. We enrolled 30 healthy children ages 2 to 18 with a median age of 8. We tested Play-Doh, where the kids played with a 3-ounce container of Play-Doh on a table for 5 minutes. We tested a home economics baking project where participants rolled out wheat-based cookie dough and then transferred it to baking sheets. We tested paper mache, where we had participants using newspaper and adhesive that was made from wheat flour, salt, and water to create a balloon bowl. And we tested dry pasta, where they played with dry wheat spaghetti for 5 minutes. And we tested cooked pasta, where they played with the cooked and wet spaghetti for 5 minutes. Okay, so before I go on, I'm sorry, there's a bunch of questions here about dishwashers and cleaning. So what I'm going to say about cleaning is that I want you to think about raw chicken. So if you were to have raw chicken on a plate or on a cutting board or in a pan, and you were going to wash whatever surface that was well enough so that you would then put lettuce on that same surface, that's how well you need to wash in order to remove the gluten. There's no universal standard for washing. We used in all of these studies singing of the song Happy Birthday because it was a standardized way in which we could assign people to wash. And we all sing Happy Birthday approximately the same way. But think about it like bacteria. If you feel safe that you're going to cook in that same space or touch that same space and not get bacteria from raw chicken juice, then you've cleaned it well enough to remove the gluten. Okay, so back to the school study. Gluten transfer and hand washing at school. So we tested gluten transfer by rubbing slices of gluten-free bread on the hands of the children. And we did this because it was the easiest way to test how much could potentially transfer into their mouths. So we know that with celiac disease, you need to eat it in order to have a reaction. So it has to get into their mouths. So not only does it have to get from the gluten-containing item to the person, but then they have to eat it. So we needed a method to test putting it in their mouths. And, you know, we can't grind up the child's hand to test how much gluten is on their hand. We took a slice of bread and we rubbed it across all of their hands, the fronts, the backs, the nails. We did not scrape under the nails, but we did rub it very rigorously all around their hands. On the surfaces, we rubbed other slices of gluten-free bread on the surface to pick up the gluten that would be there if they, for example, set a gluten-free sandwich down on a table that had not previously been cleaned. We tested lots of different hand washing. We tested soap and water while singing happy birthday, water alone, and a wet wipe. So I'm just going to start the results by showing you this container of Play-Doh. This is one of our actual study participants playing with Play-Doh. Can anyone guess how much gluten is in a 3-ounce container of Play-Doh? I can't hear you, or otherwise you would all be shouting answers at me. But the answer is 32,253 parts per million of gluten. That's a lot of gluten. So that's how much gluten a child would get if they ate an entire 3-ounce container of Play-Doh. So if you take nothing else away from today, please do not let your child eat Play-Doh. There's a lot of gluten in that container of Play-Doh. So let's keep it as something to build and play with, not something to eat as a snack. So we tested it transferring from their hands and from the table. And what we found was really, really interesting. First of all, there were no positive transfers above the 20 parts per million line from the hands. There were 2 transfers. You can see those big gray lines that spiked up from the table. And in both of those, there were pea-sized pieces of Play-Doh attached to the bread. But for the rest of them, there was not. And here's what we got after washing. So it didn't matter if it was just water, soap and water, or a wet wipe. In all 3 situations, the Play-Doh was removed from the hands and from the tables. So again, here washing works. So then we moved on to a home economics baking project. So these are some pictures of the kids doing the projects where they rolled out cookie dough and then used cookie cutters to slice them. Here's what we found. Every single scenario, there was way too much gluten. It transferred in very high numbers from the hands and from the table. The limit of quantification of the test is 84 parts per million, and almost all of them exceeded that. So again, we would not recommend this. Kids with celiac disease should not be using gluten-containing ingredients like flour in a home economics baking classroom without extremely vigilant cleaning practices, and perhaps not at all. So after washing, here's what we found. We were really surprised by this. In this situation, we had the adults do the washing. So the kids were not washing here. With water alone, it removed gluten from hands okay, but it did not remove the gluten from the tables. Soap and water did a pretty good job removing it, but again, not perfectly. And wet wipes, again, did perhaps the best job removing it, not in every single case. So again, going back to that study I talked about in the beginning about the shared baking facilities, we really want to be using gluten-free materials in baking activities in a school environment, and we want really clean environments for the kids to be using. We again used traditional soap and water, water alone, or wet wipes. In a school environment, there are very strict rules about the type of cleaning supplies they can use that are perhaps stronger. And so we would recommend for these kids going to school who are going to be cooking, thoroughly cleaned workspaces and only gluten-free materials for baking. So moving on to paper mache, again, just like the baking, sticky and wet, we actually diluted all of these down as far as we could get them so we could get the total gluten reading. And as you can see here, they were in the thousands with one up to 13,000 parts per million. So again, paper mache is a really tricky one for kids with celiac disease. The good news is it's really easy to make paper mache using gluten-free flours. So I would definitely recommend for paper mache projects to use a gluten-free paste. Now we're going to look at the results from the sensory tables using dry pasta versus wet sticky pasta. As you can see here with the dry pasta on the bottom, it's not sticky and it doesn't stick to their hands. At the top, you see the kids using the wet pasta. On the right, that child loved playing with it and really dug in there and squished it. The child on the left, however, thought it felt like worms and did not really like playing with it. And what you'll see here is a big variation in results. The dry pasta, they were all far below the 20 parts per million line. And again, there was really not a problem there, as it was dry and did not stick to them. The cooked wet pasta, however, you can see those are all up into the hundreds parts per million, except for participant 9, who was the child who thought it felt like worms and played with it very little. So again, this shows us that there is a spectrum of how children engage with different materials, but we can tell that sticky and wet are not a good combination for removing gluten. So what do we do with this data? So for Play-Doh, dry material, and other dry materials, gluten-free materials are always the best. However, if you're in a situation where gluten-free materials are not available, we believe you can allow a child with celiac disease to use these materials, provided that hand and table washing is immediately available after using these items and that the child will not eat them. If there is any concern whatsoever that the child could put these materials into their mouth, don't use them. Get gluten-free supplies or suggest an alternative. We don't want any risk of them eating these materials. There's a question, does gluten come through the skin, or is it something that makes it into their mouth? So gluten does not cross the skin. So if you have celiac disease, you must eat it in order to have a reaction to it. So for paper mache and other wet and sticky materials like baking, gluten-free only at this point. We do not have strong enough data to show that we can clean it all away. So for paper mache, for example, it's traditionally made from water, wheat flour, and salt. You can easily replace the wheat flour with rice flour or cornstarch to make the paste safe for everybody in the classroom, and no one has to feel different. All you have to do is simply switch out wheat flour for cornstarch. It costs, not very much to do, and it makes it safe for everybody, and then you don't have to worry. For home economics classes, at this time, we recommend using gluten-free materials and ingredients only. Use clean equipment and utensils, and set up the gluten-free station approximately 6 feet from other tables. We know school is a little different this year, but if your child is going into school and needs help, you can always contact your celiac center. You can contact me. I'm so happy to help people with working with schools to set up safe environments for families. So the biggest takeaway here is washing is key. In all of the situations that we looked at, cross-contact could be reduced by washing hands and surfaces. So wash with approved cleaning solutions, wash your hands, wash the tables, wash your utensils and pots and pans, and do it really well. So I want to talk a little bit about what our hospitals have heard since these studies were published. These are quotes, direct quotes from emails, from social media that I would just want to share with everyone. You're trying to make people sick so your hospitals can make more money. You're crazy. I know exactly when I've eaten 8 parts per million gluten and I get violently ill. You're fraudulent, crazy, and irresponsible. I looked at your photos and you are too young to do this research. This is nothing more than a job to you. You lack passion. You did this work in a sterile lab environment. None of your data is accurate. So who did this research? First of all, those are all really hurtful things to say to people who have really dedicated themselves to bettering the lives of families with celiac disease. So for a minute, I just want to talk about who these people are. They are physicians, they are researchers and educators from Children's National Hospital and Boston Children's Hospital, as well as the director of an early childhood education program. The studies were approved by a rigorous process of our institutional review boards, or the IRBs, and both papers were peer-reviewed in prestigious journals. Almost the entire study team has celiac themselves or a child with celiac disease. This really affects our lives too, and we just want everyone to have the best possible quality of life. And these are just a few pictures from our study days of the families and some of the kids who were involved, and thank you to all of them. Some of them may be watching right now, and I just want them all to know how much I truly appreciate them and am grateful for the time and just so much time that they put into doing this, coming in on the weekends. Our lab tech down here, Will, who spent probably over 24 hours in the lab processing all the samples on the first day of the study. I'm just so grateful to everybody for the dedication that they put into this. And so it's just not words strong enough to thank you. These are two of the leading celiac researchers in the world. In the red and white shirt is Dr. Sylvester from Boston Children's, and in the kitchen is Dr. Ed Liu at Colorado Children's. So just a little clip of them in the process. So just so you can see their faces and the people who are doing this, these are your doctors, these are your dietitians, these are the educators and lab techs who have dedicated their lives to helping us all. And we really, really just want to make life better for everybody with celiac disease. So to clarify, in case any of you, are feeling the way some of those people online felt, I'm not telling you to eat gluten. Please do not put yourself or your child in a situation where you think they're going to be exposed to gluten at levels that may cause harm. I am not telling you to be uncomfortable with the food that you eat, and I promise that I am not trying to make you sick. But what I do want you to do after today's talk is that I want you to remember that the previous recommendations were not based on data. Our data is some of the first to look at these scenarios. And I don't want you to just dismiss it. It's okay if you don't change anything or your practices, but just be aware that research happens for the better. Right now, there is a tremendous amount of research happening for a vaccine for the coronavirus. And we're all looking at that really closely. Give the same attention to research in celiac disease, read it and think about it, and participate in the process and think about how you can improve your life using that information. Also, stop hiding. To everybody who sent, our hospital got over 1,000 Facebook and Twitter messages after these studies came out. Stop hiding. Get out of behind your computer and join in with us. Come contact your celiac center, contact us, get involved, volunteer, join patient families, and help us understand better. We have had hundreds of families bring their toasters in for us to use in testing because we want to test real life toasters. So get involved. Don't hide behind the computer screen posting nasty messages to people. Get up and be involved and be a part of making our lives better. So at this point, thank you to everyone for listening today, and I am going to open it up for any additional questions. Okay, I guess I need to scroll back through all the questions, so give me a second here while I scroll back. Okay, so is gluten-free makeup and skincare not recommended? So again, this is a personal choice. With celiac disease, you need to eat it. So for little kids who are, potentially putting things in their mouths, putting their hands in their mouths, we would probably make a different recommendation than for an adult. We get a lot of questions about shampoo and bubble bath. If you are able to take a bath and not open your mouth or wash your hair without getting it in your mouth, there's no real risk. But for a child who may do that, there's no reason not to go ahead and get a version that's gluten-free to be extra safe. Personally, even though the levels are very low in the chapsticks and lip glosses that they have tested with gluten, I personally use gluten-free lip products only because I lick my lips and I don't want to take a chance. But again, it's a personal choice, but you cannot absorb gluten through your skin. You cannot absorb gluten through eyeliner on your eyes, although I don't know that I would really want wheat on my eyes. But again, it is not absorbed through your skin. Okay. Going back to the top to start with the questions that came in earlier. So it looks like somebody did post some links to the studies, and I think that Aaron says I can upload the PDFs afterwards that will live with the presentation. So I will do that as soon as we have signed off. How long did you scrub pots and pans? For the duration of singing Happy Birthday. Our dishwasher is safe. So if, again, I would go with the theory, if you feel like your dishwasher washes enough to get rid of chicken, then you are good to go. The only caveat to that is that if you take something out of the dishwasher and you still see something caked onto it, then I would absolutely wash it again. When will there be a standard set for 504 plans for schools on the national level? I'm so glad you asked. I'm actually giving a talk on that very, very, very topic at 4 p.m. today. So if you come back to the NERS Festival at 4 o'clock, I will be talking about recommendations that were just published this year by a group of 44 experts from around the United States in 504 planning. So folks asking about posting of the presentation. I believe the presentations were all recorded and will be available on the Nourish site afterwards. So, okay, in terms of sharing toasters, what we are telling families, it's your choice. This research does not mean that you have to share a toaster. It means that we're not seeing contamination from shared toasters in these situations. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a separate toaster if you feel more comfortable with that in your home. So I know lots of people who have separate toasters. My own parents have separate toasters. My mom has celiac. She's extremely sensitive. And even though she was involved in helping with these studies, she still feels like a separate toaster is right for her. And that is totally fine. For my husband and I are celebrating our 10-year wedding anniversary next month. And for the last 15 years that I've known him, every time I've been with my in-laws, I have not used their toaster until we did this study. And now I use it just fine. And it's been a really big relief to me to be able to do that and to be able to eat a hot piece of toast. But that's not the right answer for everyone, and that's okay. Does your research say that plastic utensils can be cleaned as well? So we actually did use some plastic knives with the youngest children in the cupcake cutting, and there was no difference. But again, more of that will be explained in the next study when we have much, much bigger numbers. Wooden utensils. So we did not test wooden utensils in the first round that was published in these papers, but in the future paper that we're working on, we did. The session on 504 plans and school recommendations is at 4 p.m. Eastern. Somebody is suggesting that they like to use toaster bags. Again, that is absolutely okay. Thank you for all of the really kind messages. I really appreciate it. Virtual hugs back to everybody who has sent them. So there's a question about scratches on the cookware that we used. So the cookware that we used in this study was in our diabetes care complex teaching kitchen. So it's used by different programs at the hospital for cooking classes every single day. So they are heavily used pots and pans. The pots and pans that we used in the second phase of this study were all brought in by families. So hundreds of different types of pots and pans. And we actually have pictures of all of them, which I know when we publish this is going to be really interesting for people to see the really wide variety of types of pots and pans that were used. Some of them extremely scratched up. A special shout out to our research assistant, Zach, who he brought us his toaster and pots and pans, and I have never seen equipment so torn up in my life. But we're really grateful we had that type of equipment to use, and I do owe him a new toaster for this. So this is a good reminder to send Zach his toaster. So should you use a new sponge? So unfortunately, there is no good data on sponges. So I unfortunately can't answer that question very well. But again, in my own life, I keep the same theory, is that if I've washed my sponge well enough that I think I got bacteria off of it, then I'm okay using it to clean other things. There's some comments in here about anxiety and visiting relatives. I can't even explain in detail the number of families I've worked with over the last 12 years who anxiety and depression around the holiday times has been a really big problem. They're afraid to go to their families' houses. They're afraid of getting sick. They're afraid of being a bother and not having anything to eat. There's arguments that happen amongst families. And you know, what we're hoping is that at the end of all of this, we will have really, really good data so that you have a one-pager that you can hand to your family and say, here's what we have to do to stay safe. And you can say this comes from peer-reviewed published data and this is what we need to do, as opposed to right now where people, may not be so kind about what you ask them to do. Has there been research done about getting sick from airborne gluten-containing flour? No, there has not been extensive research in bakeries on this. There's been the data that was published was looking at whether or not the airborne flour transferred to gluten-free products made in the same space, but not whether or not inhaling the flour caused damage in the gut. So the study that I cited did not look at that. It was only whether or not the flour flew and contaminated other gluten-free products. We have not tested grills yet, but we are hoping to do that in the future. And oven racks, we have not tested full-size oven racks yet, but we've tested the racks of toaster ovens. What is my opinion about restaurants and cross-contamination? So this is a really tough question to answer. I'm going to answer my personal answer. So my family chooses to eat in restaurants, although not right now. We have not eaten in a restaurant since March 12th. But we have eaten takeout and delivery from restaurants. We love to go out to eat, and we don't want to stop doing that because of celiac disease. We do our homework. So, we call ahead, we look at menus in advance, we make sure that there are gluten-free options before we go, and we do our best. But, unfortunately, it doesn't always go exactly as planned. Both my son and I have had issues with cross-contact at restaurants, but we choose to use it as a learning experience when it happens. Both my son and I have gotten sick before, and the next day we'll call the restaurant and have a conversation with them. We talk to them about what we ate and where a mistake could have happened, and we try and look for a way that it doesn't happen to anyone else again. And then depending on how the restaurant takes the information, we hope that they will use it to learn, and we can go back and eat there again safely. But we do eat out, and we love to eat out because food is such a huge part of our life. Someone asks, what are questions that I ask to a restaurant before going? So I'll always call the restaurant. So if I've never been to the restaurant before, I don't call every time if I've been there many, many times. But if it's a restaurant that I've never been to, even if we're like driving down the highway and we want to pull off for lunch, I'll call them and I'll say, we saw on your website that you offer gluten-free options. We were thinking of coming for lunch. Can you tell me about your practices? And, if they're like, hold on, we won't go. But, hopefully in this day and age, the place will say, we have safe protocols. We work to prevent cross-contamination by doing X, Y, and Z. We have a gluten-free menu. If on their website I see that they have like gluten-free bread or pizza, I'll say, can you tell me, do you have those products in stock today? Because a lot of times you stop at a restaurant that says they have gluten-free, only to find out once you're sitting there, oh, we're out of that, or oh, no, we don't have it this week, which is stressful, especially with young children. So I always call ahead. Sometimes I'll call ahead if we're going to order gluten-free pasta and ask them to start boiling the water before we get there because, right now my kids are 4 and 7. And so having to wait an extra 20 minutes for them to boil the water can often be difficult and challenging. So I'll often call ahead and remind them that we're coming, that we're gluten-free, and ask them if they can start boiling water ahead of time. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it's absolutely worth asking the question. It's also helpful because it's reminding them that they need clean water to cook the gluten-free pasta in. So people are saying, where can I access the presentation after today? So I believe it will be posted on this page on the Nourish Festival website afterwards. If I'm wrong, Erin, please let me know. So I have a website you can follow. So I actually just started at Boston Children's Hospital. I was at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. for the last 12 years, and our family moved to Boston this summer, and so I just started at Boston Children's Hospital. So for now, the best way to get in touch with me is through my email that's up on the screen right now, or eventually through the Boston Children's Hospital Celiac Disease Program website. So you can go to the Boston Children's website and just search celiac, and that page will come up as well. Erin says I am right. This page will have the recording of the presentation later. Have we tested colanders? So the first paper did not test colanders, but the paper that we're working on now, we did test colanders, both plastic colanders and metal colanders. And so far the data has looked very similar, that after washing, it is all okay. Again, we still have 2 more sites to run their data from, but we're really looking forward to writing that paper up. All right, I think that I have gotten through most of the questions that are in the chat field. So I just want to thank everybody again for joining today. And again, if you have future questions, feel free to reach out and email me at any time. And I hope to see some of you this afternoon at 4 on the Talk About School Guidelines and 504 Planning. So have a great rest of your Friday, everyone.